What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be covering more of the blueprint only input buffer system. So we're going to be following this like we did the fighting game input buffer system, and with that we're going to go basically one-to-one as much as I can. And in this episode we're going to be covering press, release, and hold inputs. So up to this point we were able to press inputs within a given window of time, like 0.2 seconds in this case. And if I can press everything fast enough, I can perform two different commands currently. There's something else we need to talk about to make some of our other commands work. So it's not always when you press an input. Sometimes it has to do with when you release an input. There's also a case where you could hold multiple inputs at the same time to perform a different action. So I'm calling those hold inputs. So we have press, release, and hold inputs. For today, we're basically going to make the press, release, and hold inputs, and then we're going to set up our current system to work the same as it has with those new inputs. And then we'll go over release inputs in their own episode and hold inputs in their own episode, as they both have a lot that we can actually do with them. So yep, that's what we're covering today. Should be a fun one. Pretty excited to get started. Before we do, if you would like to get caught up in the series, we have two different series here. So right now I'm using my Action RPG tutorial series. You can click this icon in the top right corner if you want to check out everything we've done related to that series. So you can see how we've done everything that you're witnessing here on the screen. Alternatively, if you only care about the Blueprint Input Buffer series, which you could use for the fighting game, for this, for any project, it's meant to be able to be pulled out and put into your own project of choice, then I'll link this icon in the top right corner right here, which is just the first episode of the Blueprint only input buffer. All right, and with that said, we can go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we actually understand all of our different types of inputs. So like I said, there's press, release, and hold. And what this means is any input we press or can select, we want to be able to have these options for. So if we're on a keyboard and we press down the K key, then in this case we do want to be pressing K. When we release it, we're releasing K. But it can also work on a controller. If we press down the A button on an Xbox controller and then release it, we're releasing that button. So we don't want to tie these to a specific action, a specific button. We don't want to make a new action mapping for it, nothing like that. What we're going to do is capture the events when they come into the base character BP. We have released logic here that we can then fill out. So we have pressed, released, and like I said, hold is going to be completely custom because it's basically going to be if two inputs are both in the press state and neither have been released, I'm considering that a hold input. So I'm not specifically going over this right now. The released, we're going to create the enums and the structures first, but I just want to get you familiar with that so you understand what we're doing. Now we have three structures that I think are useful here. And we can also use an enum as well if we want to. So if I go to my logic folder, I have three structures that we're going to be editing today. We have our input type structure, which is the actual type of input it is, like forward, backward, left, right, jump, attack, or the special moves. I made a new enum called input status. Alright, so to make all this work, let's go ahead and start with the enum. So you can go to Add, Blueprints, and Enumeration. Now, this is quite like our code enum, if you've seen the fighting game tutorial, called input status as well. So input status is basically one of three options, and that's our press, release, or hold that we've been talking about. Once you make the new enum, you can go ahead and go into this enum, and if you're using Unreal Engine 5 like I am, you'll have this add enumerator option here. Otherwise, if you're using Unreal Engine 4, I believe it's just a plus sign with the word add. Either way, this will work on both. Just go ahead and add as many as you'll need. Pressed, released, held. I can imagine some things like differentiating it between directional, axis or action inputs as well if you wanted, but it's not required. All that is stuff that we set up in our base character BP, specifically in our functions for setting up the input actions and axes. I don't have to go over this again because we haven't changed anything in it. but just know that we set up and accounted for those other cases, so you don't have to do anything extra to make that work. All we need is pressed, released, and held. All right. We're not changing anything with type today, so I'm going to close that one. Let's go into our structures. Now, we already had our f input info structure. If I go into that structure, it's an input name, which I'm actually just going to change to name, a timestamp, and a status. Okay, so previously, before this episode, we had name and timestamp. And the name was the E input type, and the timestamp was a float to keep track of what time this input was pressed. I've now added another variable to the structure by clicking add variable, and I've set it to our new enum E input status. So once you add a new variable, you can simply search for the new type, and you'll find it. Very simple. And I've called this status. Okay. Now, once you change f input info, it is going to change some things in base character BP, which could cause it to error out a little bit. So specifically, if I go to add input to input buffer, see how I changed input name to just name? Well, when I do that, it's going to throw an issue because I have things connected to it. So I can just right click on the node and refresh nodes. This will get rid of the errors with it, but really what it's going to do is just disconnect this. So make sure you plug in your name variables again. This is a little bit edited from the last episode you've seen, so don't worry, I will go over this. But just know as you change these structures, you might get errors and you might have to fix them up. Let's go back into our structures now. So this is what f input info looks like now. And because of this, we want to change the other things as well, the command info, and I'm going to make a new structure called f command input. All right. So let's go ahead and make that new structure first. We're going to go add again. This time we can go blueprints, structure. And I've called it f command input. So we have f command info and f command input. I know they're very similarly named. Command info is the actual information for a single command. Command input is a single input within a command. This is useful because we have f input info, which represents a single input that the player presses. But it has some things that we don't need within the command itself, such as timestamp. And we don't want to include extra data in structures where we don't need to, because they can fill out a lot of data over time, especially as we increase our command list and add more to it. So with that said, we're going to go into our new structure that we made, which is f command input. And we're going to have only the essentials that commands care about. They don't care about the timestamps, at least not yet. We'll cover that in a later episode, same as we did the fighting game. And so we only care about the type and the status. We don't have a specific number of frames to use them for this specific command. You'll notice that we do have 0.2 seconds is the amount of time that we use. Okay. However, we may want to allow certain commands to only have a certain window to differentiate attacks, differentiate counters. We could do it for a certain number of frames, not a certain number of seconds. So we can add more things to this in the future. Just think of it like this. Everything f input info has is not required by each command input. So I've made a separate structure just to make it a little bit better on performance and make it a little bit easier to work with. Anyway, like I said, I have two variables in f command input, and that's a type and a status, and it's our two enums, our e input type and our e input status. Now, once we have this set up, we can go ahead and go into our f command info because we want to change something about this now. So in this structure, we had name, inputs, and has used command. This is all good. These are the three variables we will be using. But this type before was only an e input type. I now want it to be this f command input because I want to be the type and the status. Okay, so it was already an array of e input type, but we're going to change it to our new structure, f command input. Once you do this, it is going to break some things in your base character BP. So I already showed you how to fix the name change for the f input info, but there is going to be some things that break when you change that variable in f command info. And that's specifically going to be in the check input buffer for command function. And that's right here. So at the very start of this function, we loop through every command in our command list and we break the commands. We were then looping through the inputs in each command. But the inputs variable has changed now. It's now an array of fcommand input structures. So before it was inputs, but this was only an E input type, and we were looping through this array. All right. So I had to delete the for each loop, refresh my fcommand info node, and what that did is it got it the correct variable in this break, which then we could drag into a new for each loop array. So you might just have to clear these two nodes out, rewrite them. Once you do that, it's still not going to work completely as it did, because I was dragging the array element into a reroute node down here, which was then going into an equal node. But now we have two variables, and this fcommand input will not equal the input buffer finput.info's name variable. Because it won't equal it, we have to then get the enum that will. So instead, we drag off the array element called break fcommand input. Then we have the type and the status. You can then bring the type directly into the equal node that we already had. Lastly, we had an e-input type here coming from the array. So on the break, we had the array being passed, and we were getting the length for another comparison that we did, equal comparison here. But of course, the length is determined by the array that we pass into it, and we can't pass in an invalid array type. So instead of using the e-input type, I had to delete my reroute node, and then make a new one based off this array of fcommand input structures, get the length of that array, and then pass it into the equal. Now those were the fixes to fix the break, but I'm still going to go over this function as a whole, just as a reminder, and in case you had any trouble following that, as I know you couldn't see the actual errors at the moment. I'd already fixed them. So here's the logic in a nutshell. We're going to loop through each command in our command list. By the way, you have to reset these command lists up, or the command in the command list, because each command will still be here, but the inputs array has now changed. Okay, so I have not fixed command 3. Let me show you what command 3 looks like. The type has been reset. Okay, the status defaults to pressed, but only because pressed is the default. I don't have like an e_none here. In the type, we have a none, so you can see they all default to the none value. They default to their, well, they go to their default values. And so to fix this, you have to go back and fix all of your commands that you have set up to work under this new structure now. So it's very simple. You just go into each input and select the inputs. So for command 2, I had forward, backward, attack, so I've just reset those. I'm leaving everything as pressed right now. And for the first one, I just have special move 1, special move 2. All right. Once I have my commands set back up, we loop through the commands. We break it, each one. Then we loop through the inputs that are required for that. Now we're breaking this command input to grab both the type and the status, not just the type. We're going to need the status this time as well. This logic has not changed at all. Basically what we do here is we loop through the player's inputs to see if where they're at in a command plus the next input that they're on matches the inputs that are required to perform a command. I've already gone over this in depth, and like I said, nothing changes with this, so I'm not going to go over it even more. But once we get to here, we were previously checking if the name equaled the name of, or the name of the type of the command input. That's not quite enough now. We want to see if the statuses match as well, because the status of an input, press, release, or hold, should also meet the status required by the command. Now, a lot of times it might just be pressed, but sometimes it is going to be a hold input or some multi-button input, and sometimes it is going to be a release input as well. Okay, So instead of just doing a name equals the type and then bringing it into the branch, I've added an additional equals here where I drag off the status, type equal, do equal enum, and then pass in the status from the F command input. Then, instead of going to the branch on either of those, we add an AND boolean between these two, and then pass that into the branch. Then, yet again, this is all the rest as it already has been, so I won't be covering that again. We basically determine if a command can be performed and then start that command if it can. All right. And now this is functional again with the statuses included. Now, right now, we only ever pass it a default value of the regular status because we've added the status to the F input info, but we've never done anything with it in the base character BP when an input is added to the buffer. What we do in here is we look and see if we have any inputs that we have to remove based on the time that's remained in the buffer. Then we go ahead and remove them. Afterward, we add the new input to the input buffer. However, you'll notice there's something new here now, input info status, because we have to fill this out. By default, I'm just passing in pressed, although you could manually pass in a status if you'd like. Like if you wanted to grab it from the input and pass it in, you could do that. However, I'd recommend just manually passing in pressed, release, or whatever based on the actions found here. So add input to buffer is a action mapping that we've set up in the blueprint. Right here, add input to buffer, and is bound to any key. So any input that the game receives will say, yep, I should then call this event. And it determines if it's a pressed or released already. So simply enough, if it's a pressed, we go through all this logic, we go up here, this is the pressed, and so we want to pass in a pressed status anyway. Now, we can actually go ahead and off the released, add another add input to input buffer with the status of released. If we do this, this will work in terms of adding the correct values to the buffer, but you'll notice something weird when you try and perform a command, and that's that you can't perform your commands. At least you won't be able to perform some of them. There are technically some cases where it still lines up with the inputs that you need, but with my specific commands, it won't allow me to perform them, and that's because this status no longer matches the status required by the commands in the class defaults. So if I try and perform this first command, both of them require pressed inputs, not releases. And so when a release gets added, it breaks the chain here when we try and do this comparison between statuses. This is okay. In fact, it's actually good because what we're going to do is determine if we should skip releases or not when we get into the release episode. This is the same method we used in the fighting game tutorial series to skip releases until it was required, such as for charge attacks and negative edge attacks. So with that said, you're ready to do pressed, released, and held inputs. We just have to actually define the logic we want for released and held inputs. And like I said, they're going to be their own episodes because they each have a lot that can go into them depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So guys, that's all I got for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys for everything you've done and for all the support you continue to show me. I'm really grateful. I'm really glad you guys are loving this series as much as I am. I am so excited to continue working on these episodes for you week after week, and I'm really glad you enjoy them as well. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you out and get you sorted so you can continue on with your game. Like I said, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.